Hi, I'm Jo Grace. I'm a sensory engagement and inclusion specialist and the founder of the Sensory Projects. I have a personal and professional background in special educational needs and disabilities that's probably as old as I am. So my grandfather became a paraplegic when I was 2 years old, so I have an insight into the world of physical disability. And I have family members with neurodivergent conditions. I grew up alongside differently abled people. I had a job when I was 13 supporting a brain injured gentleman in the community, and I've been a teacher working in mainstream schools and in special education, teaching students with severe and profound special educational needs and disabilities. And I've also been a registered foster carer, caring for children with severe special educational needs as designated on the forms. Since setting up the Sensory Projects about 10 years ago, I've had the opportunity to work across the board. So I get to work in adult care and in heritage settings and with various groups of therapists and things like that. And in all the work that I do, I'm seeking to contribute to a future where people are understood in spite of their differences. And the Sensory Projects run on the principle that with the right knowledge and little understanding, inexpensive items can be used creatively as effective tools for inclusion. So a lot of my stuff is very cardboard box and sellotapes. And if you want to find out about the different sensory projects, the Sensory Story Project and other projects, have a look at my website because all the information is there. And my website is www.thesensoryprojects.co.uk. But breathe now. I was supposed to be chatting on SenTalk and the tech let us down, or the internet just ate us up. So now I'm talking to myself in a room, and hopefully I get to talk to you guys live at a later point. So what I'm going to do here is just chat about some things that you might find interesting and hope that you pick up on things and ask me questions. So I'm just thinking, normally when somebody introduces you, they do all the show off bit. They go, this is Jo, and she's won awards and she's written books and she was outstanding as a teacher and all of these things. And I'm just thinking about everything that I said to you so quickly then and thinking, oh, I should have showed off more. Because what I want to do is say, look, you know, here I am, I'm a capable human being. I did stuff, you know, I have these accomplishments under my belt. And the reason that I want to do that is because the next thing I'm going to say to you is that I am autistic. And when I say that, I worry that you will make a set of presumptions about me. The first one being that I'm just going to talk to you about autism, because if I'm autistic, that could be all that I was qualified to talk about, when I don't really consider myself very qualified to talk about that. However, I am. This is the problem, isn't it? There's a huge bias and prejudice around these labels or these terms or these identities, and I think looking at how people's capacity changes depending on the context that they're in is a really interesting way of flipping the narrative around neurodivergent conditions. And actually I think the lockdown experience is a really powerful tool for this, because do you remember at the start of lockdown when everybody was going to, you know, like write that book they'd always planned to write, or take up that hobby, or get a fit? They suddenly had all this time, not if you have children of course, but a lot of people thought, wow, like I get 3 months off work, hey, we got a year off work, some people, I'm going to do all of this stuff. And then very quickly they realised that getting up and getting dressed was an achievement, because they really struggled in the environment that lockdown created, that environment where socialising wasn't so easy and meeting up with your friends wasn't possible. Well, at the start of lockdown I was pregnant, heavily pregnant. During the first lockdown I wrote a book that I've been meaning to write for about 4 years, and I did it at the start of lockdown. I wrote the book, I had the baby, I homeschooled my son, I ran my business, I did all the things. And at the start I was getting messages from people saying, can you hear my dog scratching? I'm very sorry. Saying, Jo, I don't know how you do it. Jo, you're so busy. Oh my goodness, you're doing all of that with a little baby. And you go, oh yes, I just enjoy my job. It's fine, I'm busy. And then the second lockdown came, and quite a close friend wrote to me and she said, oh, you're so busy, you've done so much, you make me feel really inadequate, because actually I've really been struggling and I haven't done my job properly, and I don't feel like I enjoyed the time home educating my children, and really I've not done well. And when I see you doing well, I think, well, I have no excuse, and I feel really bad. And I had to say to her, I haven't coped with lockdown. Lockdown wasn't something I needed to cope with. Lockdown took away from me the world that I cope with on a day-to-day basis. In my old pre-lockdown life, I bounced around the country on trains. I met hundreds of people each week, and I loved doing that. I absolutely loved it. But it came at a price. It was always something I coped with. I enjoyed coping with it. I was good at coping with it, but I coped with it. And the lockdown world, where all I have to do is sit in a room with the people closest to me, I don't cope with at all. In lockdown, I've thrived, whereas she's barely survived. And I think it's really interesting because in the day-to-day world, in a not lockdown world, many neurodivergent people are asked to exist within a social landscape that means they have to cope. And even if we're good at coping, you know, I'm somebody who has very low support needs. I face very few barriers to access. But for somebody who has high support needs, for somebody who faces more barriers to access than me, that sort of social norm is even more significant. But the whole population has just had an experience of their social situation not suiting them. Many of them have found themselves struggling with mental illness because of that. And when you look at the statistics to do with mental illness within the neurodivergent world, you'll see that we have higher rates of mental illness. And so you might look and go, oh, look, autistic people are more often mentally ill than not autistic people. That must mean that autism sort of weakens your brain and makes you mentally ill. No. Living in a way that doesn't suit your neurotype will make any person mentally ill. And our neurotype isn't a defect. We are autistic because of, they've identified about 100 genes now, and they are old genes. They're not defective genes. There's occasionally conditions where it's one gene is gone wrong somehow and it causes an autism-like condition. But for the vast majority of autistic people, it's about 100 old genes, and the combination of those genes that you get is what determines your place on the spectrum. And these genes survive in our population because they have survival value. There is a value in having different types of brain, but that value is only expressed when you can see that capacity and context. Put me in a room on my own and ask me to concentrate and I will do it beautifully. Put me in a staff meeting with a team of people and ask me to work collectively and I'll be appalling. There are places in which I am fantastically able, and there are places in which I am disabled by my neurotype. And that's not because my neurotype is autistic, that's because that's true for everybody. That's true for neurotypical people as well, as lockdown has just shown. But the bias around, the deficit-based narratives around different neurology is really dangerous. And actually, I was just thinking about the lockdown experience where lots of people have struggled with their mental health. If an autistic person struggles with their mental health, they might get a referral to mental health services, but the people who support them will have been trained and will have an understanding of mental health that's based on a neurotypical landscape in the brain. And so it's not always relevant and it's not always helpful to an autistic person, because autistic people, not only are we not represented in research around mental health, we've been actively excluded from it. So when they do a study, they will need, like, you know, we need 30 people to take part in this study and we're going to look at depression. And if somebody says that they're autistic, they get removed and they find somebody else to take that role within the study. So we have been actively excluded, and there are very significant differences in the way our brains process emotion and respond to situations that mean we need significantly different support when it comes to our mental health. And currently at the other end of lockdown, as schools reopen and life begins again, I've been thinking about this for myself actually. I have thrived in lockdown. How am I going to come out of it? I've got to pick up all of those coping strategies again. They're like a muscle that's atrophied. It's like I've been in space and I'm not sure that I can do it anymore. I really enjoyed doing it. I want to do it. I am very typical of an adult woman on the spectrum in that we learn to mask young and we get quite good at masking. So I would, it's an odd sort of pride, isn't it? I would hope, would I now? I would hope that if you met me, you didn't know that I was autistic. Not because I think being autistic is a bad thing, but just because I'm kind of proud of the skill of appearing not autistic. You know, it was very hard won. If you'd met me when I was 6 or something, you wouldn't have been surprised to have been told I was autistic. I span in the playground instead of played. You know how some people will flap their hands? I spun my hands around, and I ate a restrictive diet, and I didn't play with other children. You know, I was flagged up as odd to my mother by play workers when I was, you know, attending a little nursery when I was 2 years old. So when I was a child, you would have spotted it, but now I'm an adult. You know, I have all these tricks up my sleeve, and there is research that shows that masking damages mental health, and I can understand why. And I've read all that research, and so you read it and you think, oh, okay, I'll stop masking, and that will make it better. But it's not so straightforward, is it? Because it's as if, imagine I'd been trained as a ballerina and I've spent years and years of my life perfecting my pirouettes, and now I can pirouette, but pirouetting is damaging my body, and somebody says, oh, you should stop and just walk. You're like, but I learnt this, you know, I'm good at this. And so it's an interesting one. And I think the way I started by saying, you know, before I tell you I'm autistic, I want to tell you that I'm capable, tells you something about these deficit-based narratives that surround us. Oftentimes, it's strengths and weaknesses that are two sides of one coin. So, for example, my capacity to focus is also my weakness when it comes to change, because if I have to change from doing one thing to another, I've got to drag all of that focus. And our brains have, research shows that our brains, I'm hesitating, I'll say it and then I'll do the aside. So it shows that our brains have more connections, and the having of more connections means that you can inspect a topic more deeply. So a child might do something that appears boring because they are seemingly doing the same thing over and over again, but probably they have a really deep understanding, deeper than a less connected brain could go. And that depth of perception and attention is a massive skill set, but it gets personified as a defect because they don't play in the same way as other children play. And it's important that we all play the same. Why is that important? My hesitation was that the research, the neuroscience into autism does show those brain differences, but it also shows other brain differences as well. And what we know about autistic brains is that they are different from neurotypical brains. So if you have a study, you will see neurotypical brains all appear fairly similar, and then the autistic brains will show up as different. But the funny thing is, they don't necessarily show up as the same as each other. So the sort of the defining characteristic of being autistic is this uniqueness of mind. And that's a wonderful thing, but it gets read in a deficit-based way. And it's important that we challenge those biases and we flip those narratives, because I don't know if you've ever seen, there's little memes that go around the internet, and I will find some of them and share them, that say, you know, don't say bossy, say leadership potential. Don't say dramatic, say expressive. Don't say overly emotional, say empathetic. And there's, for all of these things, there's always a flip. There's a strength and a weakness, and it's capacity and context. In one situation, that will be a really valuable thing to be. That overconnected brain, overconnected is a a bias against a norm, isn't it? That overconnected brain I have means that my eyes are really good at picking out detail, and detail in the environment around me is really interesting to my eyes. I remember when I was 7, a little boy on the playground, and we were in a field, we were on the football field. He came up to the dinner lady and was upset because he'd lost the little metal pin that held his watch strap on. And I was standing near the dinner lady. I wasn't playing with the other children, and I wasn't standing with the dinner lady, because if I stood with her she would shoo me away and tell me to go and play. But I was standing close enough to avoid getting bullied, because if you're within earshot of the adults then you're probably safe. So I used to spend my playtimes hovering near the dinner lady, and so I was hovering near the dinner lady, and I heard this boy say that he was upset because he'd lost his pin from his watch strap, and I just thought, well, I can find that. And I walked across the grassy field, and in a huge football field of grass, yeah, no problem at all, I picked up this little metal pin and took it to the dinner lady, and I got given a jelly baby for it, so I was very pleased. But that capacity in that context is, in my home life, just the complete inability to deal with stuff around the house. I am forever sort of muttering away to myself that there are pens on tables where there shouldn't be pens, and things that aren't where they're meant to be, and it feels really petty, and I tell myself off about it. I say I'm being nagging or fussy, or I say all these nasty things to myself, and so it damages my self-esteem, and I think about myself as being a bad person, where it's just a physiological difference. I see more details. The world is in high definition to me, and it matters more to me when it's cluttered and disorganised, because it's confusing to my brain. If I can make the landscape around me clear, then I get a clear brain. And often I'm supporting people who work with children who are neurodiverse or have sensory differences, and it's one thing to be an adult who can articulate these things, it's very different to be a child experiencing them. You know, if you'd asked 7-year-old me, why are you standing near the dinner lady, I wouldn't have had an answer to you. But we can see people's sensory preferences and abilities in their behaviour. You know, if you imagine a classroom, if you set a classroom up so that one end of it was really stimulating, you've got, you know, sparkly things and things that make noise, and one end of it is quite quiet and low stim, you know, maybe a book corner with cushions and low lighting, and you allow the children just to play freely within that space, people will go to where their senses feel at home. And so the context that they're in, the environment, can communicate to you what those needs and preferences are. Sensory differences is a big one at the moment in education. There's a lot of awareness, that's the positive way of putting it, isn't it? There's a lot of awareness of sensory differences. There's lots of people who know that there are children in their classrooms who have sensory needs. There's lots of websites that you can go on and tick boxes and discover your sensory needs or discover the sensory needs of your children. And that's great because it shows an increased awareness that there is such a thing as sensory differences. The only place we've ever really had that awareness before is when we invite people to dinner and we ask them if they like the same things that we like to taste. That's just like a basic level awareness that other people sense the world differently to us. But of course those differences go all across the spectrum. But there's also the negative, strengths and weaknesses, you know, there's always a flip side. The flip side to that increased awareness is that it makes it sound like a sort of fad that we're going through, like it's a fashionable thing, a trend. And probably some people, I don't know, would there be anybody? There might be somebody who just jumps on the idea of it and thinks, oh, this is fun, I'll join in, and joins it because it's a trend. It doesn't sound plausible to me, but maybe these people exist. But in the sort of popularness of it, it kind of discredits it, and so that's problematic. In research terms, they did the research in 2006, I think it was 2009, whichever way up that digit goes, that showed a physiological difference in the brains of people who have sensory processing disorder. So a nice analogy is to imagine your senses as having volume controls on them. And in order to take in information from the world, we first need to have senses that can receive that information. So if you have a sensory impairment, your brain's not going to receive the information, or it won't receive enough of the information. But we also need it to come into our brains at a level that we can hear it. So hearing's a good example. So if I want to listen to something, first of all I need ears that work so that I can take in that information, and then I need it to hit my ear at a volume that is acceptable to me. So if somebody yells the information at me, I'll be so busy coping with the yelling that I won't be taking in the information. And if somebody whispers it to me, my little boy is currently so proud of himself because I have the quietest whisper, mummy, and then he whispers something to you and you can't hear it, and I get into these discussions with him and say, it's not a whisper. If you can't, that's just not talking. That's not, you have to be able to whisper at a level that somebody can hear. And so it's like that, you know, if it's coming in too quiet, I have to really strain, and my effort and my attention is taken up on the act of listening rather than taking in the information. But if you get you will have done it as you're listening to me now. You will have set this video at a volume that is pleasing to you. If you set it up really loud, it would be harder for you to listen to what I say, and if you set it down really low, it's going to be harder for you to listen to what I say. And our sensory processing works like that in our brain. So we have volume controls, and they are tuning in to the sensory world around us and tuning out. You know, if you are somebody who's good at operating your volume controls, then you can probably stand in a party environment and have a conversation with one person because you tune in to look at them, to listen to them, and you tune out the rest of the sound around you. And in people who have sensory processing disorder, those volume controls are broken. So they might be set too high, they might be set too low, they might be like overly greased so that they swing around all the time, but you can see it in the brain. It's a physical thing. It's a reality. That said, I think, and a lot of what I do, if you come and find me online, and I think many of you know me online already, but you'll see me around quite a lot. On Twitter, I'm at Jo3Grace, and I tweet excerpts from the research that I read, so you'll know I'm a research geek. And a lot of what I say is based on the research that I read. So when I speculate, I like to make sure people know that I'm speculating in case you think I have evidence for this. But I would speculate that if you took all the children and the adults currently identified as having sensory needs and inspected them for that brain difference, you would find only a portion of them have it. The rest definitely have sensory processing differences, but I don't think it's caused by a physiological start point. I think it's more developmental experience. So all of our senses have a development that they run through. There are things that we can respond to first, and there are things that we can respond to later on. And our later sensory skills are founded on those former ones. So in the general population, we only recognise this. Sometimes we get it with babies. I had a baby at the start of lockdown. I just told you, didn't I? We give babies black and white picture books because we recognise they're not at the level of sight that we are. So we recognise that they're not seeing in 3 dimensions and colours just yet, but they understand black and white. And that's because the brain is learning how to understand all the information it gets through its visual sense. So it's taking in all this information and trying to work out what it means. And it's easier to understand this is black and this is white than it is to understand, you know, this is peach and this is lemon yellow. So there's a start point, and then there are later skills that are founded on those early skills. And if you think of it as equivalent to another curriculum, I always do it as relating to maths. When we're first learning maths, you start off with just experiences of one and many. So like a lot of something and one of something. And then you do counting, and then you do adding and multiplying and so on, all the way up to complex algebra. Your early skills are foundational for your later abilities. If you miss out one of these early skills, so once I had a job that was inspecting schools for their provision for children with special educational needs and disabilities. And in one of these schools, I'd been there for a few days, and the team of staff there got to like me and trust me. And somebody said, "We've got this boy in year 9, and we'd really like you to come and have a look at him because his maths is really odd. We don't know what it is that we haven't taught him, you know, because," and what was happening was he was doing his maths, and one day he was doing it and getting it completely right, and so it was clear that he understood the processes he'd been taught, like he understood how to do long division or whatever it was, and then on another day he'd get it wrong. And they couldn't work out what was the difference between the 2 days. And I spent a chunk of time with him, and what I think was happening, and obviously you can't prove it, but he had no concept of number. He had no sense of how muchness a number was. And that's really foundational in maths. It's the one and many stuff at the start. So for him, numbers were all equivalent. So when he did 5 times 5 is 25, that was as plausible to him as 5 times 5 is 2,000,006, because what maths was to him was you have a number, you do something to the number, and you get a number, and they're all the same. And so because he'd missed out on that foundational part of his mathematical understanding, his later mathematical skills were sometimes okay and sometimes completely out of whack. And that works well as an analogy for the sensory world, because if people have missed out on foundational parts of their sensory development, then their later processing skills are going to be, you know, there sometimes and not there other times. And the volume controls thing also helps you to understand reactions that you might see where somebody wants a particular stimulation but then doesn't want it. So people will crave it, you know, go for it, and then suddenly it's too much, because they're like, it's like with hearing, isn't it? Like, I want to hear that. They're turning that volume control up and like, oh no, it's too loud, because they haven't yet got the skill of adjusting it just right. So what have I talked about? I've talked about autism and prejudice, and oh gosh, I mentioned that our mental health is affected by a neurotypical bias. There is, within autism research itself, just phenomenal levels of bias. It's really quite shocking to me. The book that I wrote at the start of lockdown is called The Subtle Spectrum, and it's being published on the 14th of June by Routledge. And in order to write that book, what I wanted to do was read all of the research. And in the field of autism, you can't do that because it would take you a lifetime. But I read as much as is humanly possible. And so you get a feel for the field in general. And it's so disappointing, because in my ordinary work, which is to do with sensory engagement, a lot of my work focuses on people with profound and multiple learning disabilities, who are, in research terms, qualified as the most disabled members of our society. And so I read the research that surrounds those people, and that's a very limited field because they are a minority population. Very few people are interested in researching them, and so as one person who is willing to sit and read research, you know, for sort of 10-20 hours a week, I can pretty much read it all. And it's often weak in that they weren't able to, you know, try out the thing that they're studying on many people, or they weren't able to draw a firm conclusion. But I've never seen it be so biased as the autism research is. And to give you an example, and Research Geek, you know, I look for the quality of research as well as the topic. So you would expect, if you see that research has been done by a reputable organisation, by a reputable university, you know, like it's been Oxford or Cambridge or MIT, then you're thinking already, okay, this is good stuff. This particular paper had been done by a very credible university. It had been done in conjunction with 2 other very credible universities. So another thing that you would look for is collaboration. That's a great sign. You would look for how many names are on the paper. Is this just one person like having to think by themselves, or was this a team effort? This was a big team effort. There were teams of people from these 3 universities that all got together, and they had studied quality of life for autistics as they transition from childhood to adulthood, so sort of like 17 to 24. And they had found reduced quality of life. So they were using various indicators, you know, whether we were employed, whether we had mental health difficulties, whether we'd been in contact with the police, whether we'd been victims of abuse, all of these things. And for all of them, we were more at risk. It was more likely that if you were autistic, these things would happen to you, which is fine. I have no quibble with that. The conclusion, this had been published. This had been published in a peer-reviewed journal. So it's not just those 3 universities and all the clever people in them. It's gone through peer review. So that means that other very clever people who know their stuff have checked it and have said, yes, this is good. And then it's been published in a journal, and you measure the journals dependent on their impact factor. So this is a top-ranking journal, had published this research. The conclusion said that, you know, in light of this, we conclude that being autistic causes a low quality of life. Causes. You're like, imagine that research in another field. Imagine it if you were looking at outcomes for black youths transitioning from 17 to 24. You would find a lot of similar things. You would find lower employment rates, higher mental health rates, more engagement with the police, all of those things. Lower quality of life. You would not conclude that being black causes a low quality of life. You would conclude that society has got a problem. And it's the same for autism, except for people aren't calling out that bias. Well, they are. There are some autistic-led research teams, and there's some brilliantly groundbreaking work. One of the wonderful ones to look at is Damian Milton's double empathy work, because that's one of the stories that gets told about us. You're autistic, you don't have empathy. I remember reading that when I was 11 as somebody who cared a lot about the people around her, and thinking, oh, that's really, how terrible. You're like, I must try to be better. So what the double empathy research looks at is how we understand the feelings of other people. And turns out that if you ask an autistic person to understand the feelings of another autistic person, somebody who shares their neurotype, they're quite good at it. And if you ask them to understand the feelings of somebody who doesn't share their neurotype, they make a pretty decent go of it. Whereas if you ask a neurotypical person to understand the feelings of somebody who shares their neurotype, they're quite good at it. But if you ask them to understand the feelings of somebody who doesn't share their neurotype, they're more challenged by that. Because they haven't had as much practice. There's no difference in our empathy. It's just that empathy across a neurodivide is a harder skill. But it's not a deficit we have, it's just a difference. It's like cats and dogs, isn't it? If cats understood that dogs wagging their tails meant that they were happy, and dogs understood that cats purring wasn't cats growling, then they would get along. And that's what these neuro differences are within our communities. And I'm going to stop because you've listened to me jabber on for half an hour now. There's loads more I want to talk to you about. But I'm going to stop. I hope you ask me questions. Ask me questions about the book, My Mummy is Autistic. Ask me questions about what else is going on with the emotions. Ask me about the importance of recognising the breadth of the spectrum and accepting all of the spectrum. I'm not sitting here saying everybody who's autistic is enabled by their autism. I'm not sitting here saying everybody who's autistic is disabled by their autism, but there are people who are disabled by being autistic, and there are people who are enabled by being autistic. And one end of the spectrum should not deny the other. I'm so curious to hear what you ask me. I'm shutting up. I'll hope to see you live online soon. Bye.